The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Dallas International Airport, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Dr. Amara Johnson checked her watch for the third time in 5 minutes. She had planned everything perfectly. Arrive 2 hours early, go through security with plenty of time to spare, and maybe even grab a decent cup of coffee before her flight back home. But now, standing in the security line that seemed to stretch into eternity, she wondered if she had miscalculated. Amara adjusted her blazer and shifted her weight from one foot to the other. The conference had gone well. Her presentation on innovative neurosurgical techniques had been received with enthusiasm, and several colleagues had approached her afterward to discuss potential collaborations. It had been a good week, professionally speaking. She smiled to herself, remembering the standing ovation that had followed her keynote speech. The line inched forward. Travelers around her chatted quietly, scrolled through their phones, or stared blankly ahead, lost in their own thoughts. A young mother in front of Amara struggled to keep her toddler entertained. Amara made silly faces at the child, who giggled and hid behind her mother's legs. Next, called a TSA officer at one of the document check stations. The line split into several channels, each leading to a different officer. Amara found herself directed toward the station furthest to the right. Officer Richard Keller sat at his post, his face a mask of indifference as he mechanically checked IDs and boarding passes. He'd been working at the airport for 15 years, and the monotony of the job had long since worn away whatever enthusiasm he might have once had. But there was more than just boredom behind his eyes. There was something harder, something that had grown over years of unchecked power and ingrained prejudice. As Amara approached his station, Keller's eyes flicked up, then down, then up again. Something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "ID and boarding pass," he said, his voice noticeably cooler than it had been with the previous traveler. Amara handed over her documents with a polite smile. "Good morning." Keller took the documents without responding to her greeting. He studied her driver's license, then her face, then back to the license. The pause stretched uncomfortably long. "Is there a problem?" Amara asked, keeping her voice light. "Where are you flying to?" Keller asked, ignoring her question. "Boston. I'm heading home after a medical conference." Keller's eyebrows rose slightly. "Medical conference? You're a doctor?" The surprise in his voice was unmistakable, and Amara felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the one that always came when someone expressed disbelief at her profession. She'd been dealing with it since medical school. "Yes, I'm a neurosurgeon at Massachusetts General," she replied evenly. Keller made a sound that might have been acknowledgement or disbelief. He held on to her documents, tapping them against the desk while people in other lines continued to move through. "Purpose of your visit to Dallas?" he asked, despite the fact that she'd already told him. "As I mentioned, I was here for a medical conference. I presented research on minimally invasive surgical techniques." "Right," Keller said, drawing out the word. "And did anyone give you anything to bring back with you?" Amara blinked. "Excuse me? Did anyone give you anything to carry on the plane? Something you didn't pack yourself?" "No," Amara said firmly. "I packed my own bags." By now, travelers behind her were shifting impatiently. Through the corner of her eye, Amara noticed that people in other lines, including those who had gotten in line after her, were already moving through to the security scanners. "Officer, is there some reason I'm being delayed?" she asked, gesturing to the moving lines beside them. Keller's face hardened. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am. Security procedures." "I understand that, but it seems like I'm being singled out for extra questioning." Keller stood up from his stool, suddenly making himself taller. "People like you always cause trouble, don't they? Always think they're being targeted." The words hung in the air between them. Several nearby travelers glanced over, surprised by the officer's tone. "I'm sorry?" Amara said, keeping her voice measured despite the rush of adrenaline that flooded her system. "What exactly do you mean by people like me?" "I mean people who think they're too important to follow security protocols," Keller said. But the damage was done. The implication had been clear to everyone within earshot. "I have followed every protocol," Amara replied. I simply asked why I'm being delayed while others are moving through. I need to check something. Wait here, Keller said, taking her ID and boarding pass with him as he stepped away from his station. Amara stood there, feeling exposed as other travelers watched the scene unfold. The young mother who had been ahead of her in line caught her eye and gave her a sympathetic look. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 2 minutes, Keller returned. There's an issue with your documents. You'll need to step aside for additional screening. What issue? Amara asked. Those are my legal documents and they're in order. Ma'am, you need to comply or you won't be flying today, Keller said, his voice rising. Step aside now. Amara took a deep breath. She knew this playbook all too well, had seen it happen to colleagues, friends, family members. The unreasonable request, the escalation when questioned, the implied threat. She'd been lucky to avoid it herself until now. I'd like to speak to your supervisor, she said calmly. Keller's face flushed. You don't get to make demands. Move aside now. I'm not making demands, Amara said. I'm making a reasonable request to speak to a supervisor about what appears to be discriminatory treatment. Several phones had come up around them now, recording the interaction. Keller noticed and seemed to grow more agitated. Put your phone down, he snapped at a nearby traveler who didn't comply. Amara reached for her purse, which had been sitting on the counter between them. I'd like my ID and boarding pass back, please. Don't touch that, Keller shouted, and before Amara could react, he lunged forward and grabbed her arm roughly, yanking it away from her purse. The sudden movement caught Amara off balance. Her purse fell to the floor, spilling its contents: phone, wallet, lipstick, a small notebook, pens, and her medical credentials. A collective gasp went up from the onlookers. More phones appeared, recording the incident. Let go of me, Amara said firmly, looking directly into Keller's eyes. You have no right to put your hands on me. For a moment, Keller seemed to realize he'd crossed a line. He released her arm, but the damage was done. The red marks from his fingers were already visible on her dark skin. You dropped your belongings, he said lamely, as if she had been the clumsy one. Pick them up and move aside for screening. Amara stood her ground. No, I will not move until you return my documents and call your supervisor. A tall man in a suit stepped forward from the crowd. I'd like your badge number, officer, he said in a clear voice that carried authority. I'm Professor Thomas Chen, from Georgetown Law, and what I just witnessed was a clear violation of this woman's civil rights. Keller's eyes darted around, suddenly aware that the situation had slipped beyond his control. Other travelers were muttering among themselves, and several security personnel from nearby stations had noticed the commotion. Badge number 4873, a woman's voice called out, reading from Keller's uniform. She was recording everything on her phone. Airport Security Officer Richard Keller, badge number 4873, physically assaulting a female traveler. I didn't assault anyone, Keller protested, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. She was non-compliant with security procedures. Another traveler had knelt down and was helping Amara gather her scattered belongings. When they picked up her hospital ID badge with her credentials clearly visible, they held it up so others could see. Non-compliant neurosurgeon? Someone in the crowd said sarcastically. Seems like the only one breaking procedures here is you, officer. Amara accepted her belongings from the helpful stranger with a quiet, thank you. She turned back to Keller, who was now visibly sweating. I will say this one more time, she said, her voice steady and clear. I would like my identification and boarding pass returned to me immediately, and I would like to speak with your supervisor. A security supervisor was already making his way toward them, alerted by another officer. The crowd parted to let him through. He took in the scene, the crowd with their phones out, Amara standing calmly but with visible marks on her arm, Keller looking increasingly uncomfortable. What's going on here? The supervisor asked. Before Keller could speak, Professor Chen stepped forward again. This officer physically grabbed this woman when she reached for her purse, causing her to drop her belongings. Before that, he made comments with clear racial undertones and was subjecting her to extra scrutiny without apparent cause. The supervisor looked at Amara. "Ma'am?" "That's correct," Amara said. "I'd like to file a formal complaint, but first, I'd like my documents returned so I can make my flight." Little did Officer Keller know as he reluctantly handed back her ID and boarding pass. The ground beneath his career was already crumbling. In his 15 years as an officer, he had never faced consequences for his actions. But he had never targeted someone like Dr. Amara Johnson before, and he had never done so in front of so many witnesses with cameras ready. As Amara walked toward the security scanners, accompanied by the supervisor who was now all professional courtesy, she felt her phone vibrate with incoming messages. Witnesses were already sending her their videos, unwilling to let this incident disappear into the bureaucratic void where so many others had been lost. The first domino had fallen. Officer Keller had no idea that by the time Amara's plane landed in Boston, his actions would be seen by thousands, the beginning of his self-made downfall. The security supervisor, a man named Anthony Rivera, who had been with the airport for 12 years, walked alongside Amara toward the scanning area. His face was a careful mask of professional concern, but his eyes kept darting back to where Officer Keller stood, still surrounded by muttering travelers. "I want to apologize for your experience, Dr. Johnson," Rivera said in a low voice. "That's not how we train our officers to behave." Amara nodded, still processing what had just happened. The adrenaline was beginning to wear off, leaving her hands slightly shaky. "I appreciate that, but an apology doesn't change what happened. I need to file a formal complaint." "Of course," Rivera said quickly. "We can take care of that right after you clear security. I'll personally make sure you don't miss your flight." They reached the scanners and Rivera guided her to a lane that had just opened up. As Amara placed her carry-on bag on the conveyor belt, she noticed how the other TSA officers were watching her, some with sympathy, others with unreadable expressions. News traveled fast in enclosed spaces like this. "I'll be waiting on the other side to take your statement," Rivera assured her. Amara moved through security without incident, collected her belongings, and found Rivera waiting as promised. He led her to a small office tucked away from the main concourse. "We can take your statement here," he said, gesturing to a chair across from a desk. "I'd prefer to do this more officially," Amara said, "with written documentation that I can keep a copy of." Rivera seemed taken aback. Most people, he knew, just wanted to get through their complaint and move on with their travels. "That will take more time. Your flight, I'm aware," Amara interrupted. "But I'm not interested in being rushed through this process just to catch my flight. This isn't a minor issue to be smoothed over." Her phone buzzed again. More videos from witnesses. She glanced down and saw a message from Professor Chen. "I've contacted a colleague who specializes in civil rights cases. Call her when you land. This shouldn't be buried." Rivera noticed her checking her phone. "Are you receiving the videos from witnesses?" he asked. "Yes," Amara confirmed. "Several people have sent me their recordings." Rivera's expression tightened, slightly. "I see. Well, let me get the proper forms." As he stepped out to retrieve the paperwork, Amara took a moment to collect herself. The red marks on her arm were starting to darken. They would be bruises by tomorrow. She took a quick photo documenting the injury. Then she opened her email and sent a brief message to her attorney back in Boston, attaching one of the clearest videos she'd received, just covering her bases. Rivera returned with a stack of forms and a surprisingly apologetic smile. "Dr. Johnson, I've just been informed that Deputy Director Walsh is on her way down. She'd like to speak with you personally." About this incident, Amara raised an eyebrow. "The Deputy Director? That's quite a response for what Officer Keller would probably call a minor misunderstanding." Rivera shifted uncomfortably. "The situation has escalated. One of the videos is already circulating online." Before Amara could respond, the door opened, and a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and a crisp navy suit entered the room. "Dr. Johnson, I'm Deputy Director Catherine Walsh," she said, extending her hand. "I want to personally apologize for what happened today. I've reviewed the security footage and Officer Keller's behavior was completely unacceptable. Amara shook her hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact. Thank you, Director Walsh. I appreciate your prompt attention to this. Walsh took a seat. I want to assure you that we're taking this very seriously. Officer Keller has been removed from duty pending a full investigation. Removed from duty today or permanently? Amara asked. He's on administrative leave while we investigate, Walsh clarified. But I want you to know that I've reviewed his file and there have been previous incidents. Nothing this blatant, but there's a pattern that should have been addressed. Before now? Amara wasn't surprised. People like Keller rarely began with such obvious displays of prejudice. They built up to it over time, testing boundaries, seeing what they could get away with. And who will be conducting this investigation? Amara asked. Our Internal Affairs Division initially, but given the nature of the incident and the public attention it's receiving, will likely involve external oversight as well. Amara nodded slowly. I'd like to proceed with filing my complaint now, and I'd like copies of all documentation. For the next 30 minutes, Amara carefully detailed everything that had happened, from the moment she approached Keller's station to when he grabbed her arm. Rivera and Walsh listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. When she finished, Walsh spoke up. Dr. Johnson, I want to be transparent with you. There's already significant online traction with this incident. It appears someone identified you from your medical badge in one of the videos, and your credentials as a neurosurgeon have made this story even more compelling to the public. Amara took a deep breath. She hadn't anticipated becoming the center of a viral moment, but perhaps it was inevitable in today's connected world. Director Walsh, I'm not interested in public attention. I'm interested in accountability and systemic change. Officer Keller should face consequences for his actions today, but more importantly, the environment that allowed him to believe he could act this way needs to be addressed. Walsh nodded, her expression grave. I couldn't agree more, which is why I'd like to discuss next steps with you. Next steps? Amara echoed. Your flight to Boston leaves in 40 minutes, Walsh said. You have every right to board that plane and put this behind you. We would continue our investigation and you would be notified of the outcome, but... She hesitated. But? Amara prompted. But if you're willing, I'd like to suggest an alternative. We have a later flight to Boston this evening. If you could stay, there are people from our oversight committee who would like to meet with you. Your perspective would be invaluable. Amara considered the offer. She had patients scheduled for the day after tomorrow, but nothing urgent for tomorrow. She could take the later flight and still be home tonight. I appreciate the invitation, Director Walsh, but I need to be clear about something. I'm not interested in being part of a damage control exercise. If these oversight committee members want to meet with me, it needs to be a substantive conversation about real changes. Walsh nodded firmly. That's exactly what I'm proposing. The committee includes community representatives and civil rights advocates. They've been pushing for reforms in our training and accountability measures for months. Your experience could help move those efforts forward. As Amara weighed her options, her phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number she didn't recognize. She excused herself and stepped outside to answer it. Dr. Johnson, this is Diane Reynolds from the Dallas Morning News. We've seen the video of your encounter with TSA today. Would you be willing to give us a statement? Amara ended the call without responding, but the reality of the situation was sinking in. This wasn't going to be a private matter resolved through administrative channels. It had already become something bigger. When she returned to the office, Walsh and Rivera were waiting expectantly. I'll stay for the meeting, Amara decided. But I have conditions. I want access to Officer Keller's complete disciplinary record. I want information about how complaints against officers are currently handled, and I want to bring Professor Chen from Georgetown Law with me. He witnessed the incident and has relevant expertise. Walsh looked surprised at the thoroughness of her requests, but nodded. I'll arrange for as much of that as I legally can. The disciplinary records may require some clearance, but I'll see what I can do. As they finalized the arrangements, Amara's phone continued to light up with notifications. News outlets, social media mentions, messages from friends who had somehow already seen the video. The story was spreading faster than any of them had anticipated. Meanwhile, across the airport, Officer Richard Keller sat alone in a different office, staring at his supervisor who had just informed him he was being placed on administrative leave. "This is ridiculous," Keller protested. "She was being difficult. I was following protocol." "The videos show otherwise, Richard," his supervisor said tiredly. "And the security footage is even clearer. You singled her out, made inappropriate comments, and then you put your hands on her. That's not protocol. She was reaching for her bag. I thought she might be a threat?" His supervisor interrupted. "A well-dressed professional woman reaching for her purse that was sitting on the counter? That's your defense?" Keller fell, silent, a sinking feeling in his stomach. In 15 years, he'd had complaints before. Quite a few, actually. But nothing had ever stuck. There was always a way to explain it away. Always a supervisor willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. But something felt different this time. "Who is she, anyway?" he finally asked. "Why is this such a big deal?" His supervisor looked at him incredulously. "She's Dr. Amara Johnson, chief of neurosurgery at Massachusetts General Hospital. She was here presenting research at a medical conference. She's published in dozens of medical journals and does volunteer work with Doctors Without Borders. And even if she wasn't any of those things, Richard, your behavior would still be inexcusable." Keller's face paled slightly. "I didn't know who she was." "That's exactly the point," his supervisor said, standing up. "You made assumptions based on how she looked, not who she was. And now those assumptions are going to cost you." As his supervisor left, Keller pulled out his phone and saw that it was flooded with messages. Word had gotten out that he was the officer in the viral video. Friends, family members, even his bowling league buddies were texting him. Some were asking if he was okay. Others were asking what the hell he had been thinking. One message from his union representative simply read, "Don't talk to anyone. Don't post anything online. This is bad, Richard, really bad." Keller put his head in his hands, finally beginning to understand that this time there would be no easy way out. The grave he had dug for himself was deep, and he was standing at the bottom, looking up at a sky that seemed very far away. By the following morning, the videos had been viewed millions of times. Amara woke up in her Boston apartment to dozens of missed calls, hundreds of emails, and a text from her mother that simply read, "Just saw the news. Are you okay? Call me." Amara made coffee and stood by her kitchen window, looking out at the early morning light washing over the city. She had finally made it home late last night after the meeting with the airport's oversight committee, a tense but productive 3-hour discussion that had left her cautiously optimistic. Her phone rang again, the hospital's public relations director, calling for the third time. Amara sighed and finally answered. "Dr. Johnson speaking." "Amara, thank goodness," said Pamela Wright, the PR director. "I've been trying to reach you. The hospital's getting flooded with media inquiries. CNN wants to interview you. So does MSNBC. Even Good Morning America called." "Pam, I'm not interested in doing media interviews. I have surgery scheduled tomorrow." "I understand, but this is bigger than—" "No," Amara interrupted firmly. "What happened to me at that airport happens to people every day. The only reason anyone cares is because I have doctor in front of my name and work at a prestigious hospital. I'm not interested in being the face of this story." There was a pause on the other end. "Okay," Pamela said finally. "I respect that. But the hospital needs to issue some kind of statement. People are calling us, asking questions. A simple statement supporting me and acknowledging the broader issue would be fine, but please run it by me before you release anything." After ending the call, Amara checked her email again. Among the flood of messages was one from Professor Chen, who had joined her for the meeting with the Oversight Committee yesterday. He had connected her with his colleague, a civil rights attorney named Lucia Ortega, who had already sent over some preliminary thoughts on potential legal actions. Another email caught her eye. This one from Deputy Director Walsh at the airport. "Dr. Johnson, I wanted to follow up on yesterday's meeting. As promised, I've attached Officer Keller's redacted disciplinary record. you'll see that there have been 7 formal complaints filed against him in the past 3 years alone, none of which resulted in serious consequences. I've also attached our current procedures for handling complaints against officers. After our conversation yesterday, I've scheduled an emergency meeting with our full oversight committee for Monday to discuss immediate changes to these procedures. If you have any questions or additional thoughts, please don't hesitate to reach out. Amara opened the attachments and began to read. The pattern was clear. Keller had been reported multiple times for unprofessional conduct, excessive force, and discourteous behavior. The complainants' names were redacted, but Amara could see that most were women, and based on the few details included, many were likely people of color. Yet each complaint had been resolved with nothing more than additional training or verbal counseling. No suspensions, no serious consequences, just a revolving door of complaints followed by meaningless remedial actions. Her doorbell rang, interrupting her reading. Amara looked through the peephole to see her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, an older woman who had lived in the building for 30 years. "I saw you on the news, dear," Mrs. Patterson said when Amara opened the door. "I brought you some of my banana bread. Thought you might need something sweet after what you've been through." Amara accepted the bread with a smile. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Patterson. It's not right what happened to you," the older woman continued, her voice trembling slightly with indignation. "My late husband was a police officer for 40 years. He would have been ashamed to see someone with a badge behaving that way." After Mrs. Patterson left, Amara's phone buzzed with a text from Dr. William Chen, her colleague and friend from the hospital. "Just heard what happened. Taking over your morning rounds tomorrow so you can deal with this. No arguments." These small acts of kindness were like islands in a sea of chaos. Amara returned to her kitchen table to the disciplinary records that told a story of institutional failure and began taking detailed notes. Across the country in Dallas, Officer Richard Keller stared at his living room television in disbelief. Every news channel seemed to be showing the same footage. Him grabbing Dr. Johnson's arm, her belongings scattering across the floor, the crowd's reaction. "Richard, turn that off," his wife Lisa pleaded from the doorway. "You've been watching it all morning." "They're making me look like some kind of monster," he said, his voice hollow. Lisa crossed her arms. "What did you expect? You grabbed a woman hard enough to leave bruises on her arm. It's all there on video." "You're supposed to be on my side," he snapped. "I am on your side," Lisa replied. "That's why I'm the only one telling you the truth, right? Now what you did was wrong, Richard, and this time you can't talk your way out of it." Their teenage daughter Zoe appeared behind Lisa, her face a mask of quiet shock. "Dad, my friends are sharing the video. They don't know it's you, but they're all saying how awful that officer is." Keller's phone rang. His union representative. Again, he picked up, desperate for some good news. "I've arranged a meeting with the airport's legal team for Monday," the rep told him. "But Richard, I need to be straight with you. This doesn't look good. The video evidence is damning. There are multiple witnesses, and the woman you grabbed is about as sympathetic a victim as they could ask for. A respected doctor with no criminal record who was clearly not posing any threat." "So what are you saying?" Keller asked, a knot forming in his stomach. "I'm saying you might want to consider your options. Resignation might be preferable to termination." "Resignation? After 15 years, that's your advice?" "It's just one option to consider. Look, the airport authority is under enormous pressure. The video has gone viral, civil rights organizations are involved, and politicians are making statements. They need to be seen taking decisive action." After hanging up, Keller paced his living room, fury and fear battling within him. His phone buzzed with a text from his brother. "Saw the news, what were you thinking?" That was the question everyone kept asking. What was he thinking? The truth was, he hadn't been thinking at all. He'd been reacting on autopilot, the way he always did when someone he perceived as difficult questioned his authority. His phone rang again, a number he didn't recognize. "Is this Officer Richard Keller?" asked a male voice when he answered. "Who's asking?" Keller replied cautiously. "This is David Morgan from the Daily Wire. We're doing a piece on how TSA officers are being vilified by the media for just doing their jobs. Would you be interested in telling your side of the story? Keller hesitated. His union rep had explicitly told him not to speak to the media, but the idea of someone finally listening to his perspective was tempting. I might be, he said slowly. What exactly did you have in mind? Meanwhile, back in Boston, Amara was on a video call with Lucia Ortega, the civil rights attorney Professor Chen had connected her with. Based on what you've told me and the evidence I've reviewed, you have a strong case for a civil rights violation, Lucia explained. The video clearly shows discriminatory treatment, and Officer Keller's history of similar complaints strengthens the case considerably. I'm not primarily interested in financial compensation, Amara clarified. I want systemic changes. Lucia nodded approvingly. That's where this gets interesting. We could structure a settlement demand that focuses on policy reforms rather than monetary damages. Things like mandatory body cameras for all TSA officers, independent oversight of complaints, revised training protocols, and so on. That's exactly what I want, Amara said. But, Lucia cautioned, we should be prepared for resistance. These kinds of structural changes are often more difficult for institutions to accept than simply writing a check. And there's another development you should be aware of. What's that? Amara asked. Officer Keller has apparently agreed to an interview with the Daily Wire. They're positioning the story as TSA officer vilified for doing his job. It's a predictable counter-narrative. Amara wasn't surprised. Let him talk. The videos speak for themselves. After ending the call with Lucia, Amara checked her social media briefly and was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support, and also by the disturbing number of people defending Officer Keller or questioning her account despite the video evidence. Her phone rang again. This time it was Dr. Raymond Patel, the chief of surgery at her hospital. Amara, how are you holding up? He asked, genuine concern in his voice. I'm managing, Ray. Thanks for asking. Listen, I know you're scheduled to operate tomorrow, but are you sure you're ready? No one would blame you for taking a few days. Amara appreciated his concern, but the thought of stepping away from her work now felt wrong. I need to be in that operating room, Ray. It's where things make sense. I understand, he said, but the hospital's being inundated with media requests and security has had to turn away reporters from the main entrance. It's becoming a circus. I'll come in through the staff entrance in the back, Amara assured him. And I'll focus on my patients. That's all that matters right now. After they hung up, Amara returned to reviewing Officer Keller's disciplinary record. Something caught her eye. A note about a complaint filed 3 years ago that had been resolved internally with no details provided. It was different from the others, somehow flagged in a way she didn't understand. She picked up her phone and called Deputy Director Walsh. Dr. Johnson, what can I do for you? Walsh answered promptly. There's a complaint in Officer Keller's file from 3 years ago that seems different from the others. It says it was resolved internally, but there are no details. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. That complaint was filed by another TSA officer, Walsh finally said. A woman named Tanya Diaz. She reported that Keller had made racially charged comments during a staff meeting and had created a hostile work environment. And what happened? Amara asked. The complaint was handled by Keller's direct supervisor at the time, who determined it was a misunderstanding and required no formal disciplinary action. I'd like to speak with Officer Diaz, Amara said. Another pause. She no longer works here. She resigned shortly after filing that complaint. The implications were clear. Not only had the airport authority failed to address Keller's behavior toward travelers, but they had also failed to protect their own staff from his prejudice. I need her contact information, Amara said firmly. Dr. Johnson, I'm not sure I can... Director Walsh, Amara interrupted. You said yesterday that you were committed to real change. This is what real change looks like. Facing uncomfortable truths and making things right. Officer Diaz deserves to be heard, and I intend to make sure she is. As the sun set over Boston, Amara stood at her window again, watching the city lights come on. What had begun as a terrible incident at an airport security checkpoint was evolving into something much bigger, a chance to address deep-rooted problems. That affected countless people every day. She thought about Officer Keller about to give an interview that would likely dig his hole even deeper. She thought about the Oversight Committee, forced to confront years of institutional failure. And she thought about her surgery scheduled for tomorrow, a procedure that would require absolute focus and precision. One thing was certain, the story was far from over. It was in many ways just beginning. 3 days later, the interview with Officer Richard Keller aired on the Daily Wire's website. Within hours, clips were circulating across every social media platform and news outlet. It had not gone the way Keller had hoped. "I was just following protocol," he had insisted repeatedly, his posture defensive, his tone increasingly agitated, as the interviewer pressed him with questions about the video evidence. "But the video clearly shows you grabbing Dr. Johnson's arm," the interviewer pointed out. "Is that standard protocol for TSA officers?" "She was reaching for her bag suddenly," Keller replied, sweat visibly beading on his forehead. "In that situation, we're trained to control potential threats. Dr. Amara Johnson, a neurosurgeon traveling home from a medical conference, was a threat? I didn't know she was a doctor at the time," Keller snapped. "And frankly, I don't see why that matters. The rules apply to everyone equally." The interviewer leaned forward. "But did you apply the rules equally, Officer Keller? The video shows other travelers moving through your line without similar scrutiny." Keller's face hardened. "Look, in this job, you develop instincts. Something didn't feel right." "What exactly didn't feel right about Dr. Johnson?" Keller hesitated, seeming to realize the trap he'd walked into. "I can't explain it, it's just experience." "In the video, you can be heard saying people like you always cause trouble. What did you mean by that?" The interview had gone downhill from there, with Keller growing increasingly defensive and eventually removing his microphone and walking off camera when questioned about his previous complaints. In Boston, Amara watched the interview during a rare break between surgeries. Dr. Raymond Patel stood beside her in the doctor's lounge, shaking his head in disbelief. "Did he really think this would help his case?" Ray asked. Amara sighed. "He genuinely doesn't see what he did wrong. That's the most troubling part." Her phone buzzed with a message from Lucia Ortega. "Keller just handed us a gift with that interview. Call me when you can." The past 3 days had been a whirlwind. Amara had performed 2 complex neurosurgeries while managing the growing legal and media aspects of her case. She had also finally connected with Tanya Diaz, the former TSA officer who had filed a complaint against Keller 3 years ago. Their conversation had been illuminating. Tanya had described a pattern of behavior from Keller that went beyond isolated incidents, subtle comments, unfair treatment of certain colleagues, an atmosphere of intimidation that management had repeatedly ignored or downplayed. "I couldn't stay there," Tanya had explained. "After my complaint was dismissed, Keller made my life impossible. Little things, you know. Schedule changes at the last minute, being assigned to the busiest checkpoints alone, scrutiny over minor, policy details that no one else got called out for. Finally, I just quit." "Would you be willing to make a statement?" Amara had asked. "Your experience shows this wasn't just one bad day or one mistake. It was part of a pattern." Tanya had hesitated. "I've got a good job now, at a private security firm. Better pay, better hours, better people. I don't know if I want to go back to all that." "I understand," Amara had said, "but your voice would be powerful. Think about it." Now, as Amara changed into fresh scrubs for her afternoon rounds, her phone rang. It was Deputy Director Walsh from the Dallas Airport Authority. "Dr. Johnson, I wanted to update you personally," Walsh said without preamble. "The Oversight Committee met this morning. In light of the video evidence, Officer Keller's disciplinary history, and now his unfortunate interview, we've made the decision to terminate his employment, effective immediately." Amara paused in the act of tying her scrub pants. "I appreciate you letting me know." "There's more," Walsh continued. "The committee has also voted unanimously to implement several policy changes, including mandatory body cameras for all security personnel, an independent review board for complaints, and revised training protocols focused on implicit bias and de-escalation techniques." "That's a good start," Amara acknowledged. What about accountability for the supervisors who repeatedly failed to address Officer Keller's behavior? Walsh sighed. That's more complicated. We're conducting an internal review of management practices, but these things take time. Time is a luxury many people don't have when facing discrimination, Amara pointed out. But I understand institutional change doesn't happen overnight. After finishing her call with Walsh, Amara completed her rounds and finally found a moment to call Lucia back. Keller's been fired, she told the attorney. I heard, Lucia replied, and I've got more news. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division has reached out. They want to discuss opening a broader investigation into practices at the Dallas airport, using your case as a jumping-off point. Amara leaned against the wall, taking in the implications. That could lead to more widespread reforms. Exactly, and there's something else. 3 more people have come forward with similar experiences involving Officer Keller. They saw your story and recognized him. One incident happened just 2 weeks ago. Meanwhile, in Dallas, Richard Keller sat in his living room, staring at the termination letter that had arrived by courier. The house was empty. Lisa had taken their daughter to stay with her mother for a few days, saying they both needed space to process everything. His union representative had called earlier to deliver the news before the official letter arrived. I'm sorry, Richard, there's nothing more we can do. The evidence is overwhelming, and your interview, well, it didn't help. Keller had been numb at first, but now anger began to simmer. 15 years on the job, and this was how it ended? Because of one incident? One passenger who couldn't follow simple instructions? His phone rang, an unknown number. He answered, cautiously. Mr. Keller? This is Benjamin Wells from Freedom First Legal Foundation. We specialize in representing public servants who have been unfairly targeted for simply doing their jobs. We've been following your case with interest. Keller sat up straighter. Go on. We believe you've been made a scapegoat in a politically motivated witch hunt. With your permission, we'd like to explore legal options to challenge your termination. For the first time in days, Keller felt a flicker of hope. What did you have in mind? We could file a wrongful termination suit arguing that you were simply following established procedures and that the airport authority caved to public pressure rather than conducting a fair investigation. It sounded good to Keller. Too good. What's the catch? No catch. Our foundation is funded by donors who believe in protecting the rights of public servants. We'd cover all legal costs. All we ask is that you be willing to speak publicly about your experience. After hanging up, Keller did a quick search for Freedom First Legal Foundation. They appeared legitimate, with a sleek website featuring testimonials from police officers, border patrol agents, and other public employees who claimed they'd been unfairly treated. The foundation's mission statement talked about standing up to the woke mob and defending those who defend us. Keller picked up his phone to call them back, then paused. Something didn't feel right. He searched again, this time looking for reviews or news articles about the foundation. Buried several pages deep in the search results, he found a local news story about another case they had taken on. An officer fired for excessive force. The foundation had filed a lawsuit with much fanfare, generated significant media attention, and then lost the case spectacularly, leaving the officer with a legal record that made him unemployable in law enforcement. Keller set his phone down. He needed more time to think. Back in Boston, Amara was finally home after a 14-hour day at the hospital. She kicked off her shoes and collapsed onto her sofa, too tired even to reheat the leftover pasta in her refrigerator. Her phone had been buzzing constantly. Messages from Lucia, from journalists seeking comments, from colleagues offering support, and from strangers who had found her professional contact information online. One message stood out, an email from Tanya Diaz. I've been thinking about what you said. I'm ready to speak up, not just for myself, but for everyone who couldn't stay and fight like I couldn't. Let me know what you need from me. Amara smiled tiredly and began to type a response when her doorbell rang. Checking through the peephole, she was surprised to see Mrs. Patterson again, this time holding a covered dish. I made you my famous lasagna, the older woman announced when Amara opened the door. I figured you weren't eating properly with all this going on. The simple kindness nearly brought tears to Amara's eyes. Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. That's incredibly thoughtful. Mrs. Patterson waved away her thanks. I saw you on the news again. They're saying that officer got fired. Yes, that's true. Mrs. Patterson nodded firmly. Good. Actions have consequences. My Harold always said that bad officers make it harder for the good ones to do their jobs. She hesitated, then added, I'm proud of you, standing up like this. It's not easy. After Mrs. Patterson left, Amara ate the still warm lasagna at her kitchen counter, scrolling through her emails. A new message appeared from Deputy Director Walsh, containing a draft of the new training protocols the airport was developing. Walsh had highlighted several sections and added a note. Your input would be valuable here. Is this addressing the core issues you identified? The gesture surprised Amara. Walsh seemed genuinely committed to making meaningful changes, not just going through the motions for public relations purposes. As she reviewed the document, making notes in the margins, Amara's phone rang again. This time it was her mother. How are you really doing? Her mother asked after the initial greetings. I'm exhausted, Amara admitted. But also, I don't know, hopeful? Something good might actually come from this horrible experience. I'm not surprised you're turning this into something positive, her mother said softly. You've always been that way. But don't forget to take care of yourself too. The call with her mother centered Amara, reminding her why this fight mattered. It wasn't just about one incident or one officer. It was about changing a system that had failed too many people for too long. Later that night, as Amara was finally getting ready for bed, her phone buzzed with a news alert. Former TSA Officer Keller considers legal challenge to termination with help from controversial foundation. Amara sighed. The battle wasn't over. Keller was doubling down rather than accepting responsibility. It was disappointing but not surprising. What she didn't know was that at that very moment Keller was sitting in his car outside the offices of Freedom First Legal Foundation, having second thoughts. The foundation's representative had painted a rosy picture of their chances of success, but Keller had worked in security long enough to recognize when someone was selling something too good to be true. He thought about his daughter Zoe's face when she'd seen the video, the hurt and confusion in her eyes. He thought about Lisa's words, "This time you can't talk your way out of it." Maybe, just maybe, they were right. He put his car in gear and drove away from the foundation's offices, without going inside. He didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time, he was beginning to ask himself the right questions. 6 months had passed since that fateful day at the Dallas airport. The summer heat had given way to autumn chill, and the incident that had once dominated headlines had faded from the public's ever-shifting attention. But its ripple effects continued to spread. Amara stood at the podium in a wood-paneled hearing room on Capitol Hill, adjusting the microphone as she prepared to address the Congressional Committee on Transportation Security. Through the large windows, she could see fall leaves dancing across the National Mall. Dr. Johnson, whenever you're ready, said Congresswoman Eleanor Hayes, the committee chairperson. Amara nodded and took a deep breath. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. 6 months ago, I was just a doctor trying to get home from a conference when I became the victim of racial profiling and excessive force by an airport security officer. What happened to me that day was unfortunately not unique or rare. The only unusual thing was that it was caught on camera, and I had the resources and platform to demand accountability. She gestured to the thick folder in front of her. In preparation for this testimony, my team and I collected statements from over 200 individuals who experienced similar treatment at transportation security checkpoints across the country. Their stories are in the materials provided to this committee. Amara glanced at the row of faces watching her from the committee dais. Some were clearly engaged, leaning forward with interest. Others looked skeptical or even bored. One congressman was scrolling through his phone. The legislation before you today, the Transportation Security Accountability Act, addresses the systemic issues that allowed my experience to happen. It would require body cameras for all federal transportation security officers, establish an independent oversight board to review complaints, mandate improved training on implicit bias and de-escalation techniques, and create clear consequences for violations. A congressman raised his hand, interrupting. Dr. Johnson, while what happened to you was clearly unacceptable, is there a risk that additional oversight could compromise security procedures and make Americans less safe? Amara had anticipated this question. Congressman, I'd argue the opposite is true. When security personnel abuse their power or engage in discriminatory practices, it erodes public trust in the entire system. People become less cooperative, more anxious, and the security process becomes less effective, not more. Real security isn't just about catching threats. It's about creating a system that's both effective and just. As the questioning continued, Amara remained composed and precise in her responses, drawing on both her personal experience and the research she'd immersed herself in over the past 6 months. When the hearing concluded 2 hours later, several committee members approached to thank her personally. Congresswoman Hayes shook her hand warmly. That was compelling testimony, Dr. Johnson. I think you moved the needle today. We'll be voting on the bill next week, and I'm optimistic. Outside the hearing room, Lucia Ortega was waiting, along with Tanya Diaz, who had flown in from Dallas to support Amara. You were brilliant in there, Lucia said, giving Amara a quick hug. Tanya nodded in agreement. When I left the TSA, I never imagined I'd end up here, helping to change the whole system. The 3 women walked together toward the exit, discussing the hearing and next steps. Lucia's phone buzzed with a news alert. Well, look at that, she said, showing the screen to the others. Dallas International Airport just announced they've completed the rollout of body cameras for all security personnel, ahead of any federal mandate. They're calling it the Johnson Protocol. Amara shook her head, still uncomfortable with having her name attached to these reforms. It's not about me. Maybe not, Tanya said gently. But sometimes change needs a face and a story. Yours helped make this happen. As they exited the building, a reporter recognized Amara and approached with a microphone. Dr. Johnson, any comment on Richard Keller's recent statement? Amara stopped, surprised. I'm sorry, what statement? The reporter looked equally surprised. He issued a public apology this morning. It's all over the news. You haven't seen it? Lucia quickly pulled up the video on her phone, and the 3 women huddled around to watch. On the screen, Richard Keller sat at a small desk, looking older and more subdued than when Amara had last seen him. His posture was different, less defensive, more resigned. 6 months ago, I made a terrible mistake, he began, his voice steady but quieter than in his previous interviews. I treated Dr. Amara Johnson unfairly and inappropriately at the Dallas airport. At the time, I couldn't admit what I'd done wrong. I made excuses. I blamed her. I claimed I was just following protocol. He paused, seemingly gathering his thoughts. The truth is harder to say. I saw a black woman who didn't fit my idea of what a doctor looked like, and I treated her differently than I would have treated someone else. I've spent months telling myself that wasn't the case, but I can't lie to myself anymore. Keller looked directly at the camera. Dr. Johnson, I know you probably won't see this, but I want to say publicly that I'm sorry. What I did was wrong. The consequences I faced, losing my job, facing public criticism, were deserved. It took me too long to admit that. He continued, explaining that he had declined the legal foundation's offer to fight his termination and had instead enrolled in a community college course on social justice. He described how his daughter Zoe's disappointment in him had been the catalyst for his change of heart. I don't expect forgiveness, he concluded, but I wanted to acknowledge the harm I caused and take full responsibility for my actions. If any good has come from this situation, it's the reforms being implemented to prevent others from experiencing what Dr. Johnson did. I support those changes, even though they came too late for me to benefit from better training myself. As the video ended, Amara stood silent for a moment, processing what she'd heard. Do you think he means it? Tanya asked skeptically. I don't know, Amara admitted, but it's more than I expected from him. The reporter was still waiting for her reaction, Amara considered her response carefully. "I haven't had a chance to fully process Mr. Keller's statement," she said. "But if it's sincere, then it represents the kind of reflection and accountability that's necessary for real change. This was never about punishing one person. It was about fixing a broken system." Later that evening, as her train sped back toward Boston, Amara watched the sun setting over the passing landscape. Her phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Raymond Patel. "Saw your testimony." Entire hospital staff was watching in the lounge. "Standing ovation when you finished. Proud to work with you." She smiled and typed a quick thanks. The past 6 months had been exhausting. Along with her full surgical schedule, she had given depositions, consulted on policy revisions, reviewed training materials, and met with countless officials and advocates. There had been hate mail and death threats alongside the supportive messages, requiring her to upgrade her home security system and sometimes use a car service rather than walking to the hospital as she preferred. But there had been progress too, tangible changes that would affect real people's lives. The Dallas airport's implementation of body cameras and revised training had already resulted in a 40% decrease in formal complaints about security screening. Several other major airports had followed suit voluntarily, not waiting for federal legislation. The Department of Justice investigation had expanded to include 3 additional airports with similar patterns of complaints. The settlement in Amara's personal case against the airport authority had been finalized last month. As she had insisted from the beginning, the focus was on policy changes rather than financial compensation. Though she had accepted a modest payment, which she immediately donated to establish a legal defense fund for victims of discrimination, who lacked the resources to fight back. Tanya Diaz had become the fund's first employee, using her insider knowledge of security procedures to help evaluate cases and identify systemic issues. Amara's phone buzzed again. This time an email from Deputy Director Walsh, who had become an unexpected ally. The subject line read, "Thought you'd want to see this." Attached was a photograph of the first graduating class of TSA officers to complete the new enhanced training program. They were a diverse group, standing proudly in their uniforms. The train entered a tunnel, briefly cutting off cell service. When the signal returned, Amara saw a new text message from a number she didn't recognize. "Dr. Johnson, this is Lisa Keller, Richard's wife. I don't expect you to respond, but I wanted you to know that Richard's apology today was genuine. He's not the same person he was 6 months ago. What happened changed him, changed our family. He's in therapy now. He's trying to be better. I know that doesn't undo what he did to you, but I thought you should know." Amara stared at the message for a long time, unsure how to respond or whether to respond at all. Finally, she typed, "Thank you for letting me know. I wish your family well on this journey." As the train pulled into Boston's South Station, Amara gathered her belongings and prepared to disembark. Tomorrow she had an early surgery scheduled, a procedure to remove a tumor from the brain of a 13-year-old boy. No matter what else was happening in her life, her patients would always be her first priority. Walking through the station toward the taxi stand, she passed a security checkpoint where TSA officers were checking passengers entering the train platforms. One of the officers, a young black woman, recognized Amara and gave her a subtle nod of acknowledgement and respect. Amara returned the nod with a small smile. The changes weren't perfect or complete, but they were real. A system that had allowed someone like Officer Richard Keller to abuse his authority for years was finally being reformed. People who had suffered in silence were finding their voices. Those with power were being held accountable. Outside the station, the evening air was crisp with autumn promise. Amara took a deep breath, feeling both the weight of what she'd been through and the possibility of what lay ahead. The path had been difficult and unexpected, but she had walked it with dignity and purpose. As she stepped into a waiting taxi, her phone buzzed once more. Mrs. Patterson checking if she was home for dinner. Some things at least remained blessedly normal. And perhaps that was the most important victory of all, the chance to reclaim her life, while knowing that her experience had created a ripple effect of change that would continue long after the public had moved on to the next headline. Massachusetts General Hospital, please, she told the driver, and settled back for the familiar journey home.